Namaskar and welcome to the first diplomatic dispatch of 2023. I'm your host, Vikas Swarup. In this very special episode, we will review all the major international developments of the year that has just gone by. 2022 was a difficult, disruptive, and transformative year for the world in many ways. On the one hand, it marked the easing of the COVID-19 pandemic, some progress on climate change, and record levels of world trade. But on the other hand, it marked the return of major war to Europe with the attendant threats of nuclear strikes, disruption of supply chains leading to shortages in energy supplies, food insecurity and inflation, and a world more polarized than ever before. To unpack the various strands of last year's geopolitics, I have with me two of the best experts possible. Dr. C. Raja Mohan is one of the world's leading commentators on foreign affairs and senior fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute in New Delhi. A contributing editor on international affairs for the Indian Express, he is also the author of 6 books on various aspects of foreign policy. Ms. Indrani Bagchi is Chief Executive Officer at Ananta Center and Ananta Aspen Center, India. Previously, she was Senior Diplomatic Editor with the Times of India, where she reported and analyzed foreign policy issues for the newspaper from 2004 until 2022. A very happy new year to both of you.
Same to you.
Let us begin, as we always do, with India's immediate neighborhood. Now, Raj, Pakistan was buffeted by a trio of political, economic, and climate crises in 2022. Following the ouster of Imran Khan, a mounting debt load which led to Pakistan seeking a bailout package from the IMF, and torrential monsoons, rains, and melting glaciers which flooded 1/3 of the country. Do you foresee continuing turbulence in that country?
Absolutely. I would see that. I never thought you would see Pakistan so completely losing the plot. Because when we knew that the political class had problems with the military, the civil-military relations were always problematic. But the army had the overall command to lead the country in all spheres and can get the country's act together, even in a tactical sense. But quite clearly, they don't have a plan for the renewed economic growth. They have money to import barely for 6 weeks. They're in a deep economic crisis. This is the 23rd IMF program
For Pakistan?
For Pakistan since independence. Now, I think today they're really out there, deeply divided within, not only between civil and military, but in different political parties, Imran versus the rest, an economy that is adrift, and no consensus on is to develop a new strategy to transform Pakistan's economy. And then on top of it, they're having problems with the Taliban, there's a renewed terrorism, and then of course climate change. Pakistan is one of the worst affected countries. So I think it's really a moment for them. They have to really reflect on what was the 75th year of independence for them. They're really at a low point in the last 75 years.
Indrani, now turning our attention eastwards, Sheikh Hasina paid a very successful visit to India in September, but Bangladesh also became the 3rd South Asian economy after Sri Lanka and Pakistan to seek assistance from the IMF. And in Myanmar, India continued its quiet, patient, and constructive diplomacy with the military junta, even as Aung San Suu Kyi was jailed for 7 more years. How do you see India's ties with these two important neighbors?
Well, with Bangladesh, Bangladesh's problems also stem from it's a fallout of the Russia-Ukraine war, because their energy mix is LNG, and LNG prices have gone through the roof, and LNG supplies have dwindled. So the other problem is Bangladesh's, their fiscal management is very poor. And I think the IMF, once they did their initial study, they found that Bangladesh hadn't actually counted its own reserves properly. So their reserves actually shrank. It is in our interest to have a more secular Bangladesh and a more economically powerful Bangladesh. So that means Indian diplomacy will have to work double time. On Myanmar, a lot of it is a holding operation, because India is not going to give up on Myanmar and give it over to the Chinese. There is the quieter part of trying to get the military leadership to take some responsible steps. Not all of it is succeeding, as you just said. But India has no choice but to hold on to their hands, because you really don't want the alternative. So, yes.
Now, Raj, let's look at our maritime neighbors, Sri Lanka and Maldives. Now, Sri Lanka faced its worst economic crisis in history, which led to the ouster of the Rajapaksas. India rolled out the red carpet for President Ibu Soli of the Maldives when he visited India in August. But his India First policy is being opposed by some motivated sections in the Maldives, which have been instigating an India out campaign. How do you see the future in Sri Lanka and Maldives?
Now, in Sri Lanka, they defaulted on their international debt obligations. They're really in a serious crisis, and they're interested. They've been negotiating with the International Monetary Fund for a program for a bailout. But there are two problems that are really staring at them. One, the Chinese have not been helpful as one of the leading creditors for Sri Lanka. That the idea is that to have all the creditors agree on a restructuring of Sri Lanka's debt. While India, Japan, and Europe and all the others are ready, Chinese have not been willing. So that's been one problem. Second problem has been Sri Lanka has been a pretty populist state. In a sense, it's really been far more socialist than India was in the 70s and the 80s. So there is a lot of profligate spending, where the government is simply hires people. It just runs a lot of things. So there is a problem that they have to take a lot of painful medicine, which is cutting down government employment, raising oil prices, similar to the Pakistani problem, that they have to really restructure their economy. But there I would say India has shown really a generous spirit and has really gone out of the way, despite a whole lot of issues we have with them on projects not being delivered. So I would say India has handled it very generously and with a big heart, I would say, in Sri Lanka. In Maldives, I think what you said, that here is the government wants to work closely with India, an India First policy. But the previous government and the current opposition, they're completely tied to the Chinese. So for them, when they say India out, it's not it's a campaign really to bring back China in, because China had lost out when India came in. So I think what we're going to see, this is going to be an important trend in South Asia, which is in the smaller countries, the elite is going to be divided. And that it is not that India, China are simply competing, that the elites then play one country versus another, hoping to gain power through taking advantage of the competition. So, but it's a reality that we'll have to live with and manage, because it's no longer a foreign policy issue. It is tied, intersecting with their domestic squabbles.
And now Abdullah Yameen being sentenced to 11 years in jail on corruption and abuse of power, I think is going to further complicate the situation. Indrani, now Nepal held only its second election since the country adopted its republican constitution in 2015. But the new government led by Prachand is based on an unwieldy coalition and is seen to be motivated by political opportunism. Will it last?
Good question, Vikas. To sort of continue from what Raj was saying about Maldives, which is also going in for elections, Nepal is in a similar space. China is getting into the kind of domestic politics in Nepal and in Maldives that we have not seen before. But we are seeing more and more of it now. If you remember, just a couple of years ago, the Chinese Communist Party actually sent a delegation to
bring the
make
factions
sure
together.
to bring the Prachanda and the Oli factions together. It didn't succeed. This time they have succeeded. We don't know how long it will last, because while they do, at least from what we have seen before, it's not as if they bury their personal agendas. Those personal agendas remain. And sometimes those personal agendas come out in the front, which makes it impossible for the coalition to stay on. And we've seen this happen over and over again. I don't see why it will not happen again. So the whole idea for Indian diplomacy in this region is to stay the course and keep doing the grinding, backbreaking work of quiet diplomacy.
Raj, in Afghanistan, now India opened its embassy in June, rather reopened its embassy in June, but the Taliban government continues to be unrecognized by any member of the international community. Why?
I think there are at least 3-4 major reasons. I mean, though in a sense, Taliban actually fulfills the condition of full control of a territory. They have full control. But I think given the circumstances and the history of Afghanistan, what the international community is saying is one, you must have an inclusive government, that you must bring back other groups and people who must be represented fully. Second, I think, is the question of human rights of the kind, partly the way they're treating women. Quite clearly, there are internal issues within the Taliban. And I think denying girls education is a major international concern. And the third one is the question of giving really credible guarantees that they will not host terror groups on the soil. So I think these three conditions have put a strain on their ability to win international recognition. But meanwhile, I think what we're seeing, probably this is going to be big news of 2023, which is the deepening conflict between Taliban and Pakistan. And the Taliban's, and the Pakistani accusations that Taliban is supporting the Taliban Pakistan. So I think this is going to be a serious development where the frontier between Pakistan and Afghanistan is going to start burning. And I think this is something we'll have to watch very closely in 2023.
Indrani, turning now to India's extended neighborhood.
Yeah.
How significant was the hosting of the first India-Central Asia Summit by Prime Minister Modi on the 27th of January? And how do you evaluate India's ties with Central Asia, especially in light of India chairing the Shanghai Cooperation Organization this year?
Yeah, I think a couple of things that made this relationship a little more important. First was Afghanistan and the return of the Taliban. That, if you remember, within 10 days of the return of the Taliban, we had a group of Central Asian national security advisors, including the Russian, by the way, in Delhi to basically talk about how to deal with Afghanistan. And I think that concern remains, especially if you look at the problems between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan that broke out later. The other trigger, I would say, was the Ukraine conflict. Russia has become an unpredictable partner or an unpredictable big brother in that region. And that is something that the Central Asian countries are actually now worried about. Look at Kazakhstan, look at the Kazakhstan-Russia relationship. The other reason why India has to remain very closely invested in that region is in the absence of a credible Russian leadership or a credible Russian balancing factor, that region would be completely open to Chinese influence.
Correct.
And that's something that has to be worked on with both between India, even the US, and the US remains worried about this as well, and whatever little of Russia is left. So that's going to be a very difficult one. So the SCO summit, the SCO this year is, I would say there would be very little to agree on this at SCO, but somewhere where India should make its presence felt a lot more in this organization.
Raj, now West Asia navigated a host of issues in 2022. Iran was rocked by protests by women over the issue of hijab, even as the Iran nuclear deal appeared to be headed for failure. In Israel, now Benjamin Netanyahu is returned to power, leading the most right-wing government in the history of Israel, while the UAE and Saudi Arabia seem to be hedging their security bets despite the I2U2, or the West Asia Quad as it is colloquially called. How do you see the emerging geopolitical realignments in that region?
I think the most important thing is what's happening in Central Asia that Indrani referred to. The countries of the region are trying to diversify their security partnerships. So, for example, in the Gulf, that was so totally dependent on the United States historically for security, where they felt the Biden administration was trying to reach out too closely to the Iranians. Therefore, they were diversifying their relationship, looking to Russia, where Saudi Arabia, for example, was coordinating with Russia on the oil prices. UAE is deeply engaged with China. And last few days, you had UAE and China take up the Palestine issue against the new government in Israel in the UN Security Council. So I think what you're seeing in the Middle East is, Middle East was always, you needed really a tough stomach to deal with them. Everyone has to deal with multiple contradictions. And I think those contradictions are going to sharpen in the coming days. That is one part. The second part is the money that the Gulf has today, I think we're not paying enough attention, I think. The 40 years of oil price gains that especially Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, they've accumulated massive amounts of money. And they want to invest this money. So you can't just keep money under your pillow. So they're looking for safe places to invest, not any place to invest. I think this is a historic opportunity for India. I think one of the successes of the Modi government has been the outreach to Saudi Arabia and the UAE and broader engagement with the Gulf. And we're also reaching out to other moderate countries like Egypt, who's going to be present at the Republic Day this year.
Now, Indrani, India's ties with Africa have remained robust. As Raj mentioned, President Sisi of Egypt will be the chief guest at our Republic Day. But the COVID pandemic also deepened Africa's economic crisis. Yeah. How did Africa fare overall in 2022?
I think Africa became a continent that got forgotten during the pandemic. And it was not just the pandemic. And I would say for many African countries, the old insecurities from the developed world just magnified during the pandemic and were exacerbated by the Ukraine conflict. Because not enough attention has been paid to the fact that during the pandemic that they didn't get enough vaccines. Not enough attention was paid to the fact that during the Russia-Ukraine conflict, African countries ran into a food crisis and fertilizer crisis that a lot of others don't even appreciate, not even acknowledge. And I think that has led to a great deal of resentment, great deal of disquiet, I'd say, in Africa. I think India will be hosting a Global South Summit.
Raj, now Russia's invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February was the geopolitical event of the year, marking a watershed moment for Europe. Take us through the impact of the war on the security and economic architecture of Europe and beyond.
I would agree with you that it is the geopolitical event of 2022. Russia's relationship with European countries, especially with Germany, with a large number of political parties, was deep. So I think what he has done is really he's compelled Europe to unite. He's compelled the Europeans to go to the Americans for military support because Europe can't defend itself.
Sweden and Finland.
Yeah. Countries too were largely neutral. I mean, Sweden and Finland have now joined NATO. Because there were a lot more people who are willing to be empathetic with Russia before the war. But today, as they face the brutality of the Russian attacks, I think finally you see Ukraine as a nation being forged in this fire. But I think for the rest of the world, the consequences have been pretty grim. But like always it happens, humanity's capacity to endure and come out of it. For example, Putin had bet that West Europe can't withstand one winter because of the dependence on Russian gas and oil. But I think it looks like Europe is going to weather this storm and in a process actually diversify away from Russian energy supplies. So my sense is already the oil prices are coming down. So I think those countries with some margins like India can manage this crisis. But for the poorer countries, which are already been beaten by the COVID-19 crisis, the debt restructuring crisis. So I think for them, this is going to be a long-term challenge. This is where I think India will have to step in and address the concerns of these countries.
Indrani, now India also has significant equities in Ukraine, notwithstanding our strategic and long-standing partnership with Russia, including the presence of over 20,000 Indian students there. How challenging was Operation Ganga, which was mounted by the Indian government to bring back Indian students from Ukraine?
Yeah, well, it was very, very challenging. Apart from considering the fact that in some ways, India has been accused of responding late to get the students out. But I think there were other issues there. People didn't want to come out. So when the operation was actually launched, getting students from their buses, from their hostels into the buses and the buses to the border, it was a huge operation by the government. It also meant that India had to swallow its distaste for what Russia had done and not condemn, not criticize Russia during those 6 weeks that it took us to get our children out of that country. I think there are many lessons for India in the Operation Ganga, not least of the fact that we can mount such an operation. But there are other spin-off lessons which I'm pretty certain people have taken note of. But this is something that we will see more and more often in global conflicts. And we've seen this in Iraq, we've seen this in Yemen, we've seen this in Libya, just getting Indians out of different countries during conflict or crises.
Where at least the Indian government has shown it leaves no one behind.
No, certainly. And in fact, that's a huge credit because we are a developing country. And it's not just Indians. I think we took Pakistanis,
Yes,
we took
exactly.
Nepalis, from other countries also. We've taken people from other neighboring countries. So yes, I mean, these are the kind of things that we do well, and we should continue to do well.
Raj, now how has Russia been impacted by the war in Ukraine? You alluded to it a little bit in your previous answer, and of course the attendant sanctions that were imposed on it by the West. And how has India tried to walk the diplomatic tightrope on this issue?
If I may just add something to what Indrani said about our students in Ukraine. I think India needs more doctors. There is a demand for medical education. I think we need to construct more medical colleges in India. I mean, it's not such a complicated task, but yet we've allowed our students to go to dangerous places to study. Our students who are in China for medical education, they also were victims of the COVID-19 crisis.
Exactly.
Some of them students continue to go to Russia. So I think really we need to generate that higher education infrastructure in India. Hopefully under the new education policy, we should be able to do more things. The interesting thing about for Russia is three things have happened. I mean, I think one, the Western sanctions have not led to the immediate collapse of Russian economy, which is what many people thought. It is shrinking, the economy is shrinking, but it has not collapsed. The Russians thought Ukraine will collapse. It has not. It is fighting back. The Russians thought Europe will be divided, the West will be in a disarray. That's not happened. So I think where we are today is there is a recognition on both sides. There has to be some kind of a negotiation to end this war because this can't go on forever. Already they're running out of ammunition. They're running out of weapons.
But I think the position that we have taken, where we have condemned the war, we have asked for diplomacy to take center stage, asked for territorial unity and integrity and sovereignty to be respected, while at the same time preserving our strategic partnership with Russia. I think it was really a fine balancing act.
Because we had to manage that, that path dependence on Russia. So I think, but I think my sense is 2023 is things are going to move much faster on the diplomatic front, even while the fight in winter. So therefore, I think India should be prepared for significant changes that might come out as a consequence of this war.
Now let's turn our attention to the other major powers in Europe. Indrani, the United Kingdom saw 3 prime ministers and 2 monarchs in 2022. Take us through this very turbulent year for the UK.
Well, I think at the core of UK's problems is Brexit, that they have walked away but not yet walked away. And they haven't been able to manage the consequences of. If you look just in the last 1 month, almost every sector has seen strikes, from the transport sector to the nurses to the lawyers to airport handling staff, even the border agency, who refused to stamp passports for 10 days. I cannot imagine the last time we went through something like this. We don't know what another election will bring. Certainly every opinion poll shows that the Conservatives will lose. The fact remains that the UK has a government right now that actually doesn't know which crisis to tackle first. I think Rishi Sunak has been doing a fairly decent job of looking at the economy and needing to stabilize the bond markets, the equity markets, just for the time being. Longer term solutions, not easy to find. As for the royal family, I think a bigger, 2022 certainly saw two monarchs. 2022 also saw a breakaway faction of the royal family that continues to occupy tabloid space. But I think that apart, the UK is struggling. The UK is struggling because of a loss of its power that may or may not be acknowledged, because of the Russia war, because of Europe, and because of the Northern Ireland Protocol. I think they have reached out. They have reached out on the strategic front. They've got AUKUS. They've got America remains by their side. They've tied up with Japan and Italy for a new defense sort of fighter plane, and they have reached out across the Indo-Pacific as well. For India, it remains important. UK remains a very important power, certainly for this government. And Prime Minister Modi has invested a lot in the UK. I think the idea here is that we should complete the free trade agreement as soon as possible, and that will give some stability to the India relationship.
Raj, in France, President Macron was re-elected, beating his far-right rival, but far-right won in Italy under Giorgia Meloni. Prime Minister Modi held the 6th intergovernmental consultations in Berlin in May with the new German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. How do you evaluate India's ties with Europe and with the EU in 2022?
I think Europe is emerging as an important strategic partner for India. I think for the first time, I would say in the last 75 years, that India is paying serious attention to Europe. Traditionally, we've kind of ignored this region. We used to deal with only the France, Britain and Germany on a bilateral basis, but ignored much of Europe and treated it really as an adjunct of the United States. But I think today we figure out that this government in particular has devoted enormous amount of time and energy to engage the Europeans. For example, we've reopened the trade negotiations with the EU as a whole. We've also seen France emerging as a major strategic partner for India. We saw the first first military transport aircraft agreement between Tata's and the Airbus. So this is the first time India's private sector is manufacturing aircraft that in partnership with Airbus. So that's big. So I think Europe has a lot to offer for India. I think what India is doing is, while our relationship with the US has improved, while we manage the differences with China, Europe can provide us the extra space in this situation, because each European country, small or big, has a lot of things to offer India in terms of technology, in terms of trade, in terms of mobility for Indian talent into their borders. So I think the government is, I would say, really for the first time focused on Europe.
Moving now to the Americas. Indrani, 2022 marked the election of leftist governments in Honduras, Colombia, and most recently Brazil, where former President Lula returned to power by defeating the incumbent right-wing firebrand Jair Bolsonaro. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, politicians like Hugo Chavez, Lula, and Evo Morales won elections and spurred talk of a pink tide. So do the trends of 2022 constitute a second pink tide?
I would doubt it, actually. Although, Bolsonaro didn't really prove to be a shining example of good governance on the right side. But I would hesitate to say that a pink tide is on its way in South America. If you look at what's happening in Bolivia as well, you look at what's happening in Peru, there are other churns going. Venezuela.
So voters are choosing candidates based on merits, not on their ideology.
Well, yes, I think. I don't know about the merit, but I do believe that there remains a subterranean sort of sympathy for left-wing politics. We've seen that over the years. People keep coming back. I mean, Lula's return itself, it cannot be attributed to Bolsonaro's poor governance. It is also the way the Brazilians think. And I think some of that is also seeing, but I would hesitate to describe it as a pink tide, because they remain so tied to America still. So it would not be that, even though China has a huge influence in South America, America is the United States of America is what they really have a very close relationship.
Okay, let's turn to the United States, Raj. Now, some analysts have described the Ukraine war as a geopolitical windfall for the United States. Do you agree? And how did India-US ties fare during 2022?
It is a geopolitical windfall for the United States. I mean, there's no question. First, look at purely on the monetary side. the American oil companies are simply raking it in with the high oil prices. It's not just Russia or the Gulf Arabs who are gaining from the oil prices over the years. The American oil companies are really raking it in big. And as the US cuts off a trade with oil trade with begins to cut off trade with Russia, then they have a huge opportunity there. And I think they're minting money. Second, I think it has become a fantastic theater for testing new technologies. I don't think in India we paid enough attention to the digital dynamic of the Ukrainian war, where, for example, HIMARS, the artillery system so accurately can hit the other side, which has really made a big difference in the war. And then the Starlink satellite system, it's privately owned by Musk, has helped the Ukrainians in a big way. And then now, what we're talking about, artificial intelligence, algorithmic software of this company called Palantir, which is making a big difference to how the Ukrainian shooter can target the Russian tanks. So I think we are in a revolution in warfare that's being demonstrated there. And there it's really the American technology companies that are out there. So I think that is one part. The second part is, 2 years ago, Macron was saying NATO is brain dead.
Yes.
Now it's quite clear that NATO is here and to stay. And it's not only in Europe. We've seen the Japanese, the Koreans and the Australians all engaging NATO, because NATO is no longer going to be limited to Russia, but it's also looking at China. So we're going to talk about a new situation. I think the US's biggest gain has been that it has got allies today who are willing to spend more money. It's not just US dealing with China and Russia. For example, Japan. Japan's Prime Minister has said, Ukraine is the future of Asia. If China is going to do the same thing,
to Taiwan,
what does Japan do? So therefore, you have Japan actually doubling its defense expenditure in the next 5 years. So what you have is the third largest economy in the world is now, until now, was not willing to confront China. But today, it is willing to confront China through its military capabilities. In the West, Germany and the European countries, which were quite happy letting the Americans do the heavy lifting,
yes.
Today they have to come in. So I think it is what is playing out is the US alliances which are giving it the kind of strength which we know the Russians and the Chinese, besides each other, they don't have too many partners who are big enough countries who can really tilt the balance. And that's where I think we see India, that the value of India's partnership with the US has dramatically grown. And that's one reason why I would say the Americans have largely been, while the American think tanks have criticized Delhi, the American government has not criticized India's Russia policy, because they see in the long term, a partnership with India is critical for maintaining global balance of power. So I think we're beginning to see that unfold in terms of military, the further activities of the Quad, more military cooperation between the two of us. That's one part. Second, I think, is the fact that India-US trade, we don't have a free trade treaty. We're always arguing about trade, but there's a dramatic growth in the trade. I mean, last year, it was almost more than $160 billion. And the latest figures that are coming in for this year is going to show both on the goods and services. The US is our comprehensive trade partner, and we have a surplus with the US. And then the Indian diaspora, which you dealt with when you were in office. And I think today, the Indian diaspora in the US, nearly 5 million people who are increasingly taking a larger role in the US domestic politics.
Now let's turn our attention to the Indo-Pacific. Indrani, 2022 was a landmark year for China, with the election of Xi Jinping as China's leader for an unprecedented third term. But there was also unprecedented protests against his stringent zero-COVID policy and the banking crisis in Henan. We also saw a meltdown of the Chinese stock market and the yuan falling to a 14-year low. So has all this exposed the Xi Jinping model of governance?
Well, I think certainly the zero COVID has exposed the opportunism of Xi Jinping's domestic policies, because he put sort of clamped down on COVID movement or leading up to the November elections, and soon after took this utterly irresponsible decision of removing almost every sort of lockdown, every control,
so full 180 degree.
It was a full 180 degree, and basically left millions of Chinese who have not had the natural immunity, who have been vaccinated with Chinese vaccines, which have proved to be much less than 55% efficacy. Including the fact that almost 66 or 67% of their elderly have not been vaccinated at all. And so there is, with all of that, that may have exposed it, but China still remains the second largest power in the world. And in, I think in 2022, the big debate on in the Indo-Pacific was, is Taiwan next? And what happens if Taiwan goes down the Ukraine way? I mean, of course, there are differences between Taiwan and Ukraine and the way China would handle it. But certainly that fear has made everybody else much more alert. I mean, Japan, Raj talked about Japan's defense spending. A lot of it has to do with the fact that Taiwan's security is integrally tied to Japanese security. And I mean, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was very clear on that. In the Indo-Pacific, with Australia as well, India too. I mean, you see Defense Minister taking a review of the Andaman Nicobar Islands, the Tri-Service Command this week. You can see that everybody, all powers in the region have taken, are looking at the Indo-Pacific in a more, with a sense to a proximate crisis coming their way. We are not sure how that crisis will play out, and I doubt that 2023 is the year of Taiwan, which is what a lot of doomsdayers would talk about. But certainly that preparation is beginning. You can see that, and that is going to be a theater of not conflict yet, but certainly a theater of tensions. And if you just extend it a little further, the South Pacific. I mean, South Pacific was certainly not a place where we, but the Indo-Pacific tensions of the Indo-Pacific have moved towards the South Pacific, and you've seen, you know, what we saw in the Solomon Islands, etc., over the summer. But so I would say that all of these are adding up to not create, but to heighten tensions in this region.
Raj, tensions between the US and China appear to peak during 2022, with President Biden denying Chinese access to advanced semiconductors, chips, and technology, and strengthening mechanisms like the Quad and the AUKUS. US Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan was another flashpoint. How do you see the US-China contestation playing out?
I think it's a deeply structural conflict. I mean, I think in India, there is still, every time China and the US talk, we think they're going back to G2. I think what has happened in the US is there is a new domestic political consensus that China is a problem and that problem has to be dealt with. It has taken them a long time because, after all, it was the United States that helped build China as the second most important economy and a military power. But today, I think they realize, certainly some of them realize it was a mistake on their part in the past, and that they need to really structurally challenge China. That doesn't mean they're not going to talk to each other. After all, they have billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars of trade. And there is a view also that, look, they can't let the contestation become catastrophic. Therefore, they need some guardrails, they need some engagement. So that process has begun today. I would also say that China needs the US today more than the US needing China, because US is forcing, you know, nearshoring of its companies, diversify their dependence on China. But the US, China, for example, has realized, look, if Putin loses this war, and if it makes the US stronger, and it has already pushed Japan and Australia to spend a lot more on defense. India is on the other side, also a close partner for the US. So I think for China today, it's become even more urgent they maintain a reasonable relationship. If Putin had won, they would have been in a different situation, but I think they need the US. They need to calm down the relationship. That's why China has appointed the ambassador to the US, their ambassador to the US, Qin Gang, as the new foreign minister.
Correct.
So I think they'll make an effort. My sense is there will be this talk about managing the tensions, but I think the deep structure, I think what happened in the 70s, where the US normalized relationship with China, built up China as a counter to the Soviet Union. Today, I think, sees China as a fundamental challenge and they're going to address it. And for us, I think, we need to watch this very, very carefully. And my sense is, for us, the important thing is how do we produce stability in Asia? And that we're not for containing China, we're not for isolating China. But I think we want a China that is responsible in its behavior towards its neighbors.
Now, Indrani, India-China ties also remained strained during 2022. In fact, the year ended with an unsuccessful PLA attempt to take Indian posts at Yangtze in Arunachal Pradesh. Are we in for more turbulence in 2023?
Yes. This relationship is, I mean, we do talk about the big relationship in the world that is going to pieces is the US-China relationship. We don't talk as much about how much the India-China relationship has gone to pieces. I mean, frankly, if there is somebody in Beijing should be asking the question, who lost India? And they actually have. In the limited context of how much India can decouple, you've seen the kind of decoupling moves, restricting investments, restricting projects in India that we had not seen before. There is, with the PLI schemes, with the enhanced sort of attractiveness schemes, India is trying to move some of their investments away from China. I think the test case will be Apple. If Apple can move and Apple can succeed in India, that would be a big one. But this is work in progress. I mean, people look at trade figures and say that India is still importing so much from China. Yes, it is. But I think it would be better to also look at the breakdown of that import, of the breakdown of that trade. And I think you will find that it is not, the mix has changed, not so much the finished products, a lot more in terms of plant and machinery, so that you can create capacities in this country. You're seeing that capacity slowly coming through. I mean, in India, everything takes a really, really long time. But COVID has taught us that depending on China for APIs in the way that we used to can no longer happen. So you do have sort of parks here that are doing pharmaceutical production, except that, of course, you know, we have to step it up, etc. But that is true for almost every aspect of Indian endeavor, that we have to step up everything.
Raj, going further east, South Korea got a new leader in 2022. North Korea fired more missiles than ever before in a single year. And Japan, as you said, responded by announcing a $320 billion plan for military expenditure. Earlier, of course, it was rocked by the assassination of its most charismatic Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe. How do you see geopolitics evolving in East Asia?
No, I would say, you know, South Korea is one country we've not paid enough attention to. That the transformations that are taking place in South Korea, I'll just tell you one example. South Korea is selling weapons to Poland to deal with the Russian crisis, Ukraine crisis. That South Korea is producing a new fighter aircraft. South Korea is producing a transport aircraft. South Korea's per capita GDP is about to overtake that of Japan. So we're talking about actually, despite the problems like India, Pakistan, they have a partitioned, North and South Korea. While North Korea is doing all the time provocations, what you now see under the new President Yoon is that South Korea is beginning to assert itself. That is, it is building up military capabilities. There is a nuclear debate, nuclear weapons debate in South Korea, which a lot of them feel that given what's happening in North Korea, given what China is doing in the region, that they will need either American nuclear weapons to help them or their own nuclear weapons. So I think South Korea is the country to watch in 2023 because they openly now, there is a nuclear debate. For a long time, they simply relied purely on the conventional deterrence against North Korea. But today, they're debating new nuclear options. There's a similar debate in Japan. But I think Japan has announced this new defense policy of doubling defense expenditure and of building a large missile arsenal. We talk about at least 1,000 missile arsenal, no longer playing defensive, but having the capacity to counterattack, what the Japanese call counter-strike. So they want to build the capabilities to be able to deter China and North Korea's capabilities. So I think Japan is going to be, again, a transformed nation. And I think for us, we have good relations with both. But I think time is now, but the strategic context in which these two countries operate has fundamentally changed. And both South Korea and Japan today are willing to build military, defense, security partnerships. So I think we'll have a big opportunity. South Korea has just announced an Indo-Pacific policy. Japan, of course, has done it long before.
Indrani, Australia also saw a change of government in 2022, but the free trade agreement between India and Australia came into force on the 29th of December. India also signed an FTA with the United Arab Emirates in record time. So are we entering a new era of bilateral FTAs?
Yes, I think so. I mean, after India walked out of the RCEP in 2019, there has been a bit of a rethink within Indian government, not about going back to RCEP, because we left RCEP for fairly sound reasons, that it was becoming a backdoor entry for China into India's market. But what the good part about that was, India did a little bit of its own rethink to say where are its markets, where does it export to. It doesn't really export that much to Southeast Asia. It actually exports much more to the UAE, to Europe, etc. So if you look at the shift, UAE, I think we set a record of being the fastest negotiated free trade agreement. So tells you about the kind of complementarities that exist between the two economies that we had not noticed earlier. Australia actually is I would say the Australian free trade agreement is a strategic document, because Indians had opposed a free trade agreement with Australia for a very long time. So I think the fact that we have tells you a much bigger story of where the strategic relationship between these two countries are. You're also seeing the same free trade, as Raj said. Europe has become so much more important to India. I mean, we have reopened the most contentious trade
EU,
negotiations,
the EU,
which is the EU negotiations, and I think there is reasonable expectation that by 23 we will have it done.
Turning finally to global issues. Now, Raj, India just ended its 8th tenure as a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. What were the highlights?
I would begin by saying that there is a difference in the 8th term that we've just finished than the ones before. I mean, you dealt with the UN when you were in the government. I think we tended to be really ideological in terms of the very macro kind of issues when in our earlier, membership of the temporary membership of the Security Council. What we saw this time was a focused pursuit of India's national interest in the Security Council. I think we took up 3 issues. One is terrorism. We had the UNSC Permanent Committee on Counter-Terrorism meet in India for the first time. So we pursued that with much vigor. We've also, where Prime Minister Modi spoke at a convention we called on maritime security, where India's interests in the maritime domain were put forth, and we produced for the first time a UNSC resolution on maritime security. And then on peacekeeping, because India is the world's one of the largest contributor nations for peacekeeping, and that using new technologies and other means to give greater protection and safety to the international peacekeepers. So I think what we've done for the first time is to combine our national interest with the global interest and push them forward on a vigorous basis in the Security Council. We also, of course, continue to pursue the question of India's permanent membership under the agenda of reform multilateralism. I'm not so sure if that is going to happen anytime soon, because China is going to continue to block us.
Indrani, the COP27 meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh produced a landmark loss and damage agreement that, in theory, will lead wealthy countries to compensate poorer countries harmed by climate change. The COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity also adopted a landmark global biodiversity framework. So was 2022 a good year for the fight against climate change?
No, it was not. Because while COP27 actually saw people putting out a document, on the ground you could see a serious backtracking on climate goals, and that was triggered by the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because it's for everybody moving towards renewable energy. there was an equal and opposite reaction to moving towards fossilization, and we are not going to get. So ultimately, I don't think we moved forward at all. In fact, we moved backward. It was not a good year for climate at all. And frankly, as we have seen from the Paris Accord, even from COP26, the $100 billion that the rest of the world was supposed to make available has not. Yes. The loss and damage came largely because people were shocked by the visuals of Pakistan. The fact remains that Pakistan hasn't got a shred of international aid for this, and it's actually not international aid that's going to help them. It's going to be a complete overhauling of how they look at their own climate policies. Internally, yes, we will do all of this, but globally, I don't think we moved anywhere at all.
Raj, the year ended with India taking over the presidency of the G20 from Indonesia following the Bali G20 summit. How does India intend to leverage its presidency to be the voice of the global south?
I think for India, it's an opportunity as well as a major challenge. It's an opportunity because the G20 is really the fully representative global forum, and where we can actually try and put some of the issues of concern to us and to the developing countries, which have been neglected because of the Ukraine crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic we saw. So I think there is an opportunity to elevate some of the issues of interest to us to a higher plane on the global agenda. But at the same time, we should also be cautious. We should recognize this is not a good moment for multilateralism. That multilateralism works best when the major powers are willing to work with each other. That is in the period between 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, till, I would say, in the last 3 years. US, Russia, China, Japan, Europe, everyone was on the same page in terms of global economic integration, in terms of avoiding conflict. But today, there is a political military contestation on the economic side. The understandings that we arrived at with the WTO, today those are broken down because China has weaponized global trade. And I think other countries are adjusting to that, including India, which has walked out of many free trade agreements. So I think this is going to be a pretty difficult time to produce consensus on big issues.
Well, thank you very much, Raj and Indrani, for that brilliant tour d'horizon of the world in 2022. 2022 was indeed a momentous year for geopolitics. In a world, to use the words of External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar, more fragmented, more tense, more on the edge, and more under stress than ever before, India navigated 2022 with a lot of dexterity and skill. And as India leads the G20 towards an inclusive, ambitious, action-oriented and decisive agenda, the world will look to India in 2023 with hope and trust. Thank you for watching this special review of 2022. And from all of us at Diplomatic Dispatch, here's wishing you, our viewers, a very happy, healthy and abundant 2023. Till we meet again next week, take care and goodbye.